Thanks for joining us for what is the final event in the Festival of Urbanism, a conversation about how we create our cities, our urban places. Now, while I might work in a bank these days in sustainability, I started my career in architecture and urban design, and I remain a passionate advocate for creating and nurturing great cities. So I'm really thrilled to be here tonight. Now, we hear the term open used regularly, and often in the context of data or software. Tonight, we'll be talking about something perhaps a little more tangible, the built and social environment, the places in which we live. And co-creation is a concept we hear a lot about these days, often in relation to how we create products or services. Tonight, we're going to explore how we apply similar ideas in tapping the wisdom and directly involving the community in designing future places. What in the world of services we might call customer-centred design, here in the world of urbanism, we might call customer-centred design. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Sydney's Lord Mayor, Clover Moore, a champion of involving the community in shaping the city's villages and in crowdsourcing from residents, business and cultural practitioners, a highly recognised city sustainability strategy, Sydney 2030. Lord Mayor.
Thanks, Siobhan, and welcome everyone to Lower Town Hall. This has been the most wonderful day for Town Hall as a people's place. We had thousands of people here this morning for a most inspiring and uplifting memorial service for Gough Whitlam. Noel Pearson's speech was just extraordinary, and Kate Blanchett was quite fantastic. And the Sydney Symphony played Gough Whitlam's choice of music, and the whole thing was quite amazing. We're down here doing this important work, and then I'm going to have to slip away at 6:30 because we're also doing the Sydney Peace Prize upstairs, and Julian Burnside, I'm going to be presenting Julian Burnside with the Peace Prize on behalf of the city. So what a fantastic day for our wonderful Town Hall. Yes, give our Town Hall and the people of Sydney a big clap. So, welcome to you all. I'd like to first of all acknowledge the original custodians of our land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and also acknowledge the people of the 200 nationalities who live in our city, and especially welcome Professor Stephen Cairns, the architect, urban planner and scientific director of Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore, our panel, Siobhan Toohill, who you have already met, Westpac's Head of Group Sustainability and Community, Associate Professor Rod Simpson, Sydney University's Director of Urbanism and someone who's done a lot of work with the city, and Professor Jane Marceau and Lucy Cole Edelstein. Lucy, of course, is from the community engagement firm Straight Talk. So I'm going to say a few words first. I've welcomed you all, yes. I want to thank our panel. For giving up your time and expertise tonight to work with us. For the first time in history, over half the world's population live in cities, and that proportion is growing, and by 2050 it's estimated it will rise to 70%. Here in Australia we are already highly urbanised, with 2/3 of our population living in cities. And shamefully, our current federal government, while collecting 82% of our taxes, does not have a cities policy, and instead is funding roads that will increase congestion rather than investing in public transport. Just today, we learnt from the media that the state government is planning a huge road interchange around two sides of our beautiful Sydney Park. I'm sure all of you have been to our beautiful Sydney Park and have seen the work that we've done there over the last 10 years and how fantastic it is. So this is part of that great project, the WestConnex motorway, a plan that will bring tens of thousands of cars into the already congested local streets and further separate some surrounding residential areas from their parklands. It's right back to the 1950s. In Asia and Europe, all levels of government work together to ensure significant urban developments have public transport services and facilities provided prior to development. And in this era of climate change, there would be infrastructure for renewable power, water, and conservation and other resources, but not in New South Wales. This is why I treat grand announcements like the Bays Precinct with reservation. In New South Wales, we're enticed with great hopes and grand schemes. Experts are called in, the community might be given a preliminary say, and then years pass and we're left with developments that are most often much denser than what was promised, that aren't supported with appropriate infrastructure, and that aren't sympathetic to the surrounding areas. Sydney deserves better. New South Wales needs a new approach to planning and urban development, especially when you consider what we've experienced in recent times on significant renewal sites, and I'll refer to two of them. In 2003, the state government announced that the stevedoring wharves at East Darling Harbour would be transformed into a new urban precinct called Barangaroo. The community welcomed with optimism the concept plan, developed after an international design competition, but fast forward to 2014, and with numerous incremental changes, increasing floor space in the development, now by 70% if the latest proposals are approved. While a casino, which has not gone out to tender, is proposed for harbour foreshore land set aside for public parkland. Green Square, the city's largest renewal precinct and one of Australia's largest urban renewal projects, is a 278-hectare redevelopment area, the largest urban renewal area in Australia. It was earmarked for redevelopment in the mid-1990s, and despite the airport train line opening in 2000 on the very western fringe of the area and development on sites such as Landcom's Victoria Park and Meriton's ACI site, the project was virtually moribund when I was elected Lord Mayor in 2004. The obstacles to development seemed insurmountable. Land for the town centre was in multiple ownerships, including land required for essential infrastructure. The costs to deal with flooding and contamination were high. There was no commitment to public-funded infrastructure to stimulate private sector investment, and state agencies lacked any direction or impetus to get solutions to site drainage, and there was no plan for adequate public transport. So, what did we do? We began a comprehensive review of the financing, zoning, land use, urban design, retail, traffic, transport, street layouts, stormwater management, social planning, open space, community facilities, and overall infrastructure of the site. Subsequently, the Green Squares Consortium, in fact, many years later, in 2009, in fact, the Green Squares Consortium was established. And when the consortium argued that the town centre wasn't viable without increased density, and this is, of course, because we don't have government investment, we agreed to reconsider new planning proposals, which we took to the community. Then we developed a fully costed comprehensive infrastructure plan, and we are now investing $440 million over the next 10 years to provide the services and facilities a growing community needs, like new roads and footpaths, flood drainage works, a state-of-the-art library, a new community centre, childcare, new parks and playgrounds, affordable housing, and a beautiful new aquatic centre, a design for which I announced early this week. We are not the Transport Authority, unfortunately, but because the state government failed to act, the city had to purchase the land for the new transport corridor for light rail, which was on the map in 1995 when the announcement was first made. But fast forward to 2014, we are still lobbying for light rail. We are still waiting, along with the growing community, for the state to finally reveal its transport plans, as well as its plans for state schools, because guess what? The people who are living there are going to have children, and they're going to want to go have childcare and go to school. And of course, the other facilities needed for the population, because it's planned to be 54,000 people by 2030, and it's planned to have 22,000 workers. In contrast to the approach by our state and federal governments, a development in Copenhagen called Halloran, which I have visited, shows how urban development should be managed with involvement of all levels of government. Halloran is a large 200 square hectare urban development, so it's not as big as Green Square, that is transforming an industrial harbour, a bit like Barangaroo, into a sustainable residential and employment centre. It's being undertaken by the Danish government in collaboration with the city, which is the planning authority, unlike here, with Barangaroo and Bayes Precinct. The project is managed by a company run on a commercial basis and owned by the City of Copenhagen, 55%, and the state, 45%. When I was there, I said to them, well, what's the private development involvement? And they said there isn't any. The government, the two levels of government are doing the infrastructure. The development will come later. I thought it was just extraordinary. The completed project will house around 40,000 people with a corresponding number of jobs in a dense town structure. It will include mixed ownership to encourage social diversity, with mixed-use residential buildings, business areas, cultural buildings, waterfront activities, a harbour park and beaches. Harbour park and beaches in Copenhagen. You know what the climate's like in Copenhagen. But still, they're doing beaches. Essential new infrastructure and sustainability are key components. A new metro system is being developed, linked to the broader metro system, music to our ears, and the intention is to provide a maximum 5-minute walk to every part of the district. And it will be energy efficient with district heating and cooling. Buildings will be designed for low energy demand with efficient installation for low temperatures heating and high temperature cooling. Opportunities are also being considered for a range of renewable energy sources. It's a tale of two cities. So back to Bayes Precinct. This is an incredibly significant harbour foreshore area. Its renewal provides tremendous opportunities for Sydney, but to reach its full potential and to contribute to Sydney's future growth and livability, it must be seen as more than just a building site. It should not be treated as a quarry for potential high-rise commercial and residential development to deliver more stamp duty to the state government coffers. The community needs to be involved in developing a long-term vision for the site. The vision has to be backed by a long-term plan that goes beyond electoral cycles, as well as, importantly, a plan for staged financial commitment outlining how infrastructure and other facilities will be provided. And then it needs to be implemented with purpose, needs to be driven by the planning minister, by the government, working in cooperation with the city. At the forefront of planning for the Bayes Precinct must be the concept that this is publicly owned land and its development must bring clear public benefits. Decisions need to be open and transparent with proper planning processes and design excellence as key elements. No more unsolicited proposals. In this day and age, sustainability should be a fundamental part of any plan to redevelop the precinct, and it's not acceptable to redevelop large parts of our city based on power from the coal-fired grid. The area with its deep water port, maritime fleet, fish markets and power station represents an important remnant of Sydney's fast disappearing maritime and industrial history. Its renewal must recognise this by conserving and adapting significant buildings and structures and providing creative interpretations of history. An integrated public transport strategy, including ferries, is essential and should prioritise maximising access and sustainable operation. The City of Sydney has the second highest residential densities in Australia, and like our council, who adjoins the precinct, also has the fourth highest, so a range of transport options is vital. A diverse range of housing, including affordable housing and accommodation for students, should be part of the mix, though carefully located so as not to preclude maritime and working harbour uses in the precinct. A new development should respect the heritage and character of existing neighbourhoods. Public access to the foreshore must be maximised and new space provided for the local community. Just 2 weeks ago, we were proud to declare open to the public 300 more metres of Glebe's Harbour Foreshore Walk, adding to the 2.17 kilometres already completed. The city and the local community have argued strongly for the retention of the Glebe Island Bridge. Apart from its intrinsic heritage value, the bridge also provides protection for small recreational craft like kayaks and dragon boats in Blackwattle and Roselle Bays. This new precinct could substantially boost the economic life of the city and the state. It could provide new space for our universities, become a hub for sustainable research and development, and allow for the expansion of startups and creative industries. Most importantly, its redevelopment must serve a larger vision for Sydney, one that will meet important broader needs for housing and jobs, while integrating with surrounding areas and benefiting local communities. Thank you. I hope this session tonight is very productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to Elders past and present. And congratulations also on the response to the Green Square Aquatic Centre design competition and the announcement yesterday. I think it's such a real win for Sydney and for local architecture stacking up in an international design competition. Now, I would like to welcome to the stage our keynote speaker for tonight, Stephen Cairns, and the director of the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore, And don't forget, #megaprojects.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for coming. Lord Mayor, you've really taken the words from my mouth, and there's not much more I can really add. But I am contractually obliged to add, so bear with me. I hope I can maybe flesh out some of these themes in a little bit more detail. So again, good evening and thanks for coming. I'd like to begin by thanking Rod and his team for inviting me. It's super to be here, and super also to be here with you to help think through some of the wonderful kind of challenges that are before us here in Sydney. My talk is really informed by recent discussion on the wider processes of urbanisation and their consequences for sustainability. In mature cities like Sydney, emerging cities, and of course the thousands of cities that are yet to come between now and the end of the century. So that said, I hope also to offer practical approaches and practical modes of thinking about the urban planning challenges that are particularly here in Sydney, but also that have been discussed through this Festival of Urbanism over these past weeks. And I'll do that by discussing three things. There are three main sections to this talk. First, I'll begin with a set of kind of rather more theoretical principles, urban design approaches, and that are often gathered under this term, as Siobhan said, this term open city. And here I'll relook at the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam of 2009-10, which really focused on this theme and brought many of these large debates together for under the one sort of theme for the first time. The second thing I'll do is then look a little bit more in more detail in a practical case study, and here I'll turn to Hafen City, a very well-known urban redevelopment project in Hamburg. But that project is now 50 years old, so many of the principles that were developed there, in fact, are already starting to look a little bit dated. So the final section of my talk, I will attempt to look forward and think a little bit more about the fortunes of the future city, of the open city idea, and cluster of ideas. And I will do that by looking at the work of some of my colleagues in the Future Cities Laboratory based in Singapore, which is my current institutional home. Just a couple of things to think about as we go along. Of course, we will be going from Rotterdam, or engaging perhaps in Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Singapore, and how we move between those specific circumstances of those cities and the generic principles that the open city stands for is a very important kind of transition, I think, for thinking about what they might mean or don't mean for planning here in Sydney. One final kind of footnote, I would also reflect on the excitement of this building. If you can imagine all the activities that are going on in this building today, in miniature, it would represent, I think, some of the best features of the idea of the open city. Co-present, perhaps incommensurable functions, but nonetheless co-present, held together in the same space, technically mediated, perhaps if it wasn't for the clattering of the bottles, but nonetheless we understand that architecture has to bring people together in different programs at the same time, and this is one of the central things about the open city and one of the central themes that I will begin with when we turn to Rotterdam. So, the chief curator for the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam in 2009-10 was the Dutch architect Kees Christianse. He and his curatorial team dedicated the Biennale to the theme, the open city, designing coexistence. And as one of the curatorial team, I recall being thrilled at the prospect of being offered the Netherlands Architecture Institute building, which is a wonderful, rambling, modern building, and we were offered that building to kind of think through how we might curate this fantastic theme of the open city. Now, the open city is a useful, this Biennale in particular, is a useful point of entry into this kind of theme that I want to talk about this evening, not simply because on the gallery walls were many, many examples of open cities and approaches and tools and so on. But it was really more to do with the fact that the building itself was curated to be an open city in miniature and also for the period of 6 months only. So it's a kind of very gentle sort of bite-sized chunk of open city experience and theory that I would like to kind of begin with. And it gives us in a way a kind of digestible approach to what is often a kind of rambling and relatively loose set of themes. So one of the first So one of the first design decisions that was involved in curating the building and the open city theme was to completely replan the Netherlands Architecture Institute building. And this involved relocating the entrance and completely inverting the circulation system of the building, as you can see from the two diagrams. So the diagram at the top is the existing plan. The entrance is through this very narrow sort of drawbridge space, through the ticketing space in white, and then on into this big square black box gallery. And what we did was simply invert that and bring people directly across this bridge that you can see, directly into the base of that black box space, and we christened it the Forum, and we thought this should be the center of the exhibition and the center of this idea of a kind of miniature open city. Of course, we had massive institutional support, and we also had very, very good curatorial support, which allowed us to do this kind of major kind of intervention. This is an image from the inside of that space as it was reconfigured very soon after the opening of it. And if you look closely, if you're an architect, you can look at the plan, but you can look closely, you can see many, many different coexisting activities, scheduled, sometimes unscheduled in this space. Clearly, on the left, there is a ticketing and entrance sequence, which of course is required. There's a cafe and a bar in the top of the image. There's an information booth. At the bottom of the image is a bookshop. There's a lecture theatre on the far right-hand side. There are sampler exhibitions. There are provocations. There are play areas. There's Lego sets. There's chess sets, and so on. And all of this coexisted in a relatively tight space for a period of 6 months. So what allowed all of these things to kind of coexist? And this was one of the kind of central kind of secrets and one of the kind of experiments that we hope to kind of uncover over the course of this exhibition. One kind of clue, I think, comes from urbanist William White, who called interactions between two people through a third object or through a third event, he called that triangulation. And in that act of triangulation, you produce a kind of social interaction that wouldn't have been possible without that third element, object, event, game, whatever it might be. So in some ways, we were interested in developing and thickening the social medium, the interactive kind of medium that was at the center of this exhibition idea and was at the center of the open city kind of principle. So think about this kind of idea of a kind of thickening social medium in this space as it unfolded over this 6-month period. First of all, the space could hold large opening events like this, where the space was almost completely full. It could support smaller seminars and tours of exhibitions like this, so small groups of people talking around with curators around the key principles. It could support much more formal lectures, as you can see in the top right. It can support power meetings, as you can see here. This is George Broekman, who is the director of the Biennale program, for example, perhaps negotiating the next deal. Where are we in the sequence? And of course, we can have individual and much more quiet reverie events as well. So people browsing in the bookshop, people looking at exhibitions in their own time and in their own terms. And the remarkable thing about this event is that many of these things happened simultaneously at the same time, and there seemed to be very little need to engage technically in order to produce oral or visual privacy. And then finally, there are many people who came and never went to the exhibition at all and simply spent their time in the cafe because it happened to be such a pleasant place to be. It is worth noting there is one very important technical intrusion in the space, and I think it's from the previous slide. But the lecture theatre had a sort of a felt covering that dropped down over the kind of lecture itself and muffled the external sound. So, but apart from that, most of these events happened roughly at the same time and seemed to kind of coexist quite well. Now, all of these principles were then gathered as good academics we were in a publication which was widely read and is, I think, today still widely used. Now, that experience was very important for us because it confirmed many of the things that we felt about this kind of open city idea, and confirmed many of the kind of challenges as well around precisely these technical interventions that we had to make. Slightly more theoretical are a couple of drawings here that we drew out of that kind of experiment, if you like, and tried to thematize in a much more kind of precise way. So this relatively simple and deceptively simple drawing in a way encapsulates two of the central urban planning principles. The city as a tree is compared with the open city. The city as a tree is founded on axial and hierarchical kind of relationships. It produces separation. It's based on the logic of the cul-de-sac. Socially, it's typically aligned with segregation, either in economic or in social terms. And programmatically, it typically supports monofunctional programs in cities. And I think we all recognize different versions of this drawing. The open city, on the other hand, typically relies on multi-directional street patterns, for example. It typically also then produces in a social register the coexistence, and also supports diverse programmatic fields. And you may not be able to see the colors on this, but we can well imagine different programs overlapping and intersecting. So a knowledge quarter, perhaps, with a commercial quarter, with a civic quarter, sliding by each other. And we can also think this through time, an industrial quarter being replaced by another kind of form of economy over time. So there's a kind of archaeology as well to the open city diagram that we tried to thematize here and would like to kind of promote, of course. We can think about that drawing in a much more evidently architectural drawing, so a classic figure ground drawing. In this instance, many of the principles of the open city are elaborated in a little bit more detail. Different block sizes, a fine granularity of the city, a very beautiful transition between private spaces, which are represented in this figure ground format in black. So black is private. The white spaces are the public spaces, and then there are kind of transition spaces, as you can see, of many different size and scale and form. So this produces a kind of, I think, a slightly more sort of grounded image of this kind of idea of the open city. And then the image on the right shows you, in addition to that, the flows of people, the flows of goods, and also their origins and destinations, but also where they become confluent, if you like. And I want to come back to this at the very end of the lecture, because how we address and how we think about precisely these flows and how we manage them and engage with them to the ends that I've just in a somewhat utopian way outlined is precisely the arc of research that we would like to follow. So this is the last of this slide, and I won't linger on this too long, but it does try and encapsulate some of the sort of, in a way, some of the kind of mantras that we try to thematize. So open cities try to produce environments of encounter, and this is precisely the experiment that we did in the open city forum space, offering high capacity, an opportunity for diverse forms of social interaction. So the individual solitude, the small group meeting, the full-blown opening, and the party, and so on. What we couldn't achieve here, of course, is an environment of coexistence, which tends to be a much more sustained kind of form of interaction, and this is one of the themes that we developed in Halloran City. Fine-grained, dense urban texture, I think, is relatively widely accepted now as a very important kind of principle for this kind of urban approach. Multi-directional, interconnected street networks, I will come back again to that in more detail. Functional diversity, again, as we've already alluded to, the way in which functions can overlap and interpenetrate each other. And then finally, in planning and time. So ensuring that the temporal kind of dimension is present in the way in which we think through large and complex things, such as city making. So in miniature, of course, the open city gives us a kind of a sense, a feeling, and perhaps some of these kind of rudimentary kind of theoretical principles by which we would then proceed. So what I would like to do now is move from Rotterdam to Hamburg and think a little bit more detail and introduce you to the Halloran City project. It's important to note that the Halloran City project predated the Rotterdam Biennale, so in a way, but also post-dates it. So it's a much more sort of long sort of complex project. So there are ideas that are germinating in the work of this work that then became, that were pulled together and theorized in the context of the open city. So Halloran City is one of the world's largest and most comprehensive urban redevelopment projects. Covers over 150 hectares, will be home to 12,000 people, and the workplace of 40,000 people. It adds 10.5 kilometres of new public waterfront. It includes a dense network of cycling and pedestrian footpaths that's 2.5 times the length of the road network. It was planned with open city principles in mind and was intended to set a benchmark for new urban quality in terms of planning, sustainable urban development, and indeed governance. Now, the history and geography of Hamburg is a very important dimension in the open city idea and became a very important principle inside the development of the Hafen City project. So if you will allow me a little historical detour. As you see, the slide shows the medieval trade routes in Europe. This, of course, for those of you who know your history, this is an image of the Hanseatic League, and this is one of the very first trading city networks. And it's an important point of entry into the story about a city because it reminds us that cities are never isolated. They're always operating inside kind of networks of trade. And Hamburg, by definition, by its involvement in the Hanseatic League very early on, was already, in a way, commercially speaking, an open city. It was by constitution a kind of open city. So the Hanseatic League was a number of cities that really were in the Baltic and in the North Sea. There's over 100 cities that were part of this league, and it ran between 1300 and started to peter out in 1700. And it's very important because it was one of the first cooperative kind of trading networks that allowed cities to kind of trade with each other and also, of course, to specialize. And this gave one of the very special features of Hamburg as it developed over time. And as you can see, the Hanseatic League also was integrated with the trading networks in the Mediterranean, of course. So it was the beginning of a kind of global network, or at least a kind of a trans-regional network for urban development. And of course, it's no accident that world systems theorists in contemporary days are going back to look at this, to think about how city cooperative kind of networks might work. So we begin by thinking about Hamburg by looking outwards and thinking about it in its relationship to other cities. For those of you who know Hamburg, of course, you know that it sits on the Elbe River, and it also has a hinterland behind it, if you like, up that river, which is another kind of important dimension of its geography. If we look much more closely at Hamburg itself, you can see the historic center of the city, its fortifications, and from the very beginning we can see the Hafen City site, the port site, that was so important as a kind of interface between Hamburg and the Hanseatic League, and also Hamburg and the hinterland further up the Elbe River. We're jumping around in history here, but this is the beginning of the 20th century. German industrialization is well underway. The German economy is the largest and the leading economy in Europe by this stage, and you can see that reflected again in the urban form, vastly outstripping the former boundaries of the historic city, which you may be able to recognize the shape of it in the middle. But as we go through these kind of images, please keep in mind also this small kind of strip that was later to become the site of the Hafen City. And then to zoom out once more, it's a very important, this is a kind of footnote to the story, a very important one. This is Hamburg, again, located in the very center of this image, but in the context of the watershed of the Elbe River. And there are two kinds of blue here. The dark blue is the normative kind of flow of the river, and the pale blue is the flooding, the storm surges of that river. And that has a massive effect later on the planning of Hafen City as well. So keep in mind this very important kind of contextual framework and contextual fact. So let's fast forward and look a little bit more closely at Hafen City itself. You can see now the beginnings of the site where Hafen City was later to be developed. This is a wartime image, and you can see the harbor beginning, in a way, its relative long decline. After the war, the partition of Germany basically cut off Hamburg from its hinterland. So the East German border was some 200 kilometers up the Elbe River, and basically one of the kind of rationales for the Hamburg port was cut off and destroyed. So this is the beginning of the end, if you like, of the heyday of the Hamburg port. There's all kinds of other reasons, like the mechanization of port activities and so on. But basically, this is the beginning of the end of this as a kind of thriving port region. And then if we fast forward now, we can see the beginnings of the Hafen City project itself installed upon that very site. And this is the thing that I will elaborate in a little bit more detail now. So there are some very useful images on the Hafen City's website, which is a very good, very detailed kind of website. And there's a number of images that give us a kind of sense of sequence of the development of the project. And there's a couple of things I just want you to follow as we go through this. There's about 4 or 5 sequences of these aerial images. This is Hafen City before the idea emerged. So the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. The idea of having to rethink, in a way, Hamburg's historical relationship to its hinterland became an issue again. So Hamburg, in a way, became an important issue, the planning of Hamburg on the national scale. So nothing really has been done, but clearly the sense of potential is very evident in this image. The docks that you see, the copper-roofed buildings are very important. These are transshipment warehouses that have become a very important part of the heritage and have become an important part of the Hafen City project. And for those of you who know Herzog and de Meuron's work, you might recognize the base, the foundation in this large warehouse in the front, this triangular shape that is later to become, many still hope, the Elbe Philharmonic Hall. And again, I'll tell you that story a little bit, I'll refer to it at least as we go along. So this is a few years later, I think 97. Some development has already happened, and I think that's important to kind of note. So this is the beginning of thinking through a much more comprehensive approach to the planning of Hafen City. And despite that, a number of laissez-faire projects have already developed. So there are 2 housing projects, which you can see in this image. It's useful kind of to think about these images because they in a way try to be responsible by following the vernacular of the warehouses. And the warehouses dropped directly into the canal. So these images, these 2 buildings tried to imitate that format. Now, that format works very well for goods, where the barges could come in and lift their goods directly up into the warehouse, but it's a complete disaster, if you like, for developing a kind of public interface with the water. So this is an important early kind of warning in the Hafen City planning. Now, unfortunately, there's a few missing in that sequence, so we're fast-forwarded to 2007. The Hafen City project has been run. The competition was run. It was won by Kees Christianse for KCAP, the firm that I work with, and they have installed basically a very simple master plan that I will describe in more detail, and this is the first results of that, at least in 2007. And we'll come back to these images in a moment. 2009, again, now we can start to see the Philharmonic Hall emerging. This is the famous Herzog de Meuron iconic kind of project, a much troubled project, emerging further. Still, the thickening of the Hafen City fabric in behind, the refining, the fine grain, all of those things that we talked about at such great length in the Open City exhibition are evident here and being developed and manifest in a material way. You can see how dominant this project is over time. Certainly for the photographer's eye, it's a very important project. So 2012. A couple of other things you've seen, perhaps noticed that there is a snaking pontoon bridge which was developed, which is then inserted. And this is very important because this is the work of another architect. This is EMBT, Benedetta Tagliabue, and this is her work, working inside the kind of larger master plan. And that firm won the competition to handle the kind of public works, the public space design for the project. So it really enlivens up what is a relatively straightforward and very, very kind of quite rigid, geometrically speaking, rigid master plan. I think this is the final in the sequence. Okay, let's turn back a little bit and give 2 or 3 kind of simple conceptual sketches about the approach to the master plan. So again, this is KCAP, Kees Christianse's firm, and they won the competition to do this, and their approach to this, I think, is very instructive for some of the discussions which are happening here in Sydney today. The first thing, of course, is to recognize that mini-potted history that I just sketched. It also understands the historical sort of boundaries of the fortifications that was established around the city. It also understands the role of those warehouses, those transshipment warehouses, as a kind of interface, and also the island condition of Hafen City itself. All of these flood quite badly. All of them are on the outside of the dike, which protects Hamburg. So there's a very specific set of flood mitigation strategies which had to be developed relatively early on also in the project. Connection and orientation kind of strategies. Highlight, I guess today we would call these iconic sort of sites, if you like, were identified very early as a kind of an articulation of what was going to be a very generic urban fabric. A series of quarters with local planning regulations developed inside each of those with particular kind of identities, and then all of it then replaced back on the top of it to give you a kind of a sense of orientation. So these drawings, I think by today's standards, look very, very simple, and that was the case. It was one on a very simple set of propositions. But in fact, I think the results are really, really quite remarkable. I think the simplicity of the drawings with the complexity of the outcome is something very, very interesting to kind of think about. So what I'm going to do now is take you into a couple of those keys at the far left-hand end, which are most kind of developed. And then I will take you through the Übersee quarter in the middle, which is half developed, and it will give you a sense again what happens from the master plan level, the open city loose master plan, as we burrow down into particular sites and particular quarters. I'm going to try and speed up a little here. So this is the overall this is the current imagined outcome of the Hafen City project. We're about halfway through, as I'll show in a minute. So this is a really beautiful image of that central sort of pontoon structure, a kind of ephemeral structure that enlivens, that comes up and down with the water, with the flooding, and a series of the generic sort of blocks that I described behind. There's a huge amount of effort going into how to bring the public down to the water itself. And given the real difficulties of flooding, there's a series of kind of stepped, a very important kind of sectional sort of logic to the scheme, which allows this kind of low-level engagement with the water. All of these surfaces, of course, are sacrificed during the flood, designed to be sacrificed. So this kind of stepping logic was a very important part, which comes directly out of the Hamburg geography. Every now and then, there is a project that breaks with that kind of format, and this break is a break from the master plan, but emerges directly out of discussion around the kind of sub-master plan that I described. And perhaps we'll have more time to talk about that later, but this is a very, very interesting departure, I think, from the idea of a kind of rigid master plan. So in overview, it's a remarkably rich place to be. You can be a pedestrian at one level and then find yourself at another, down against the water and then above. You can see some of the elevated pedestrian decks are precisely elevated to operate during the flood, so the whole city can still operate while it's inundated. And then you can see here this very dark, gloomy image of the old warehouse district, which again makes a kind of real relief from the sort of the highly populated areas of the rest of the city. So this is it, a relatively recent image of Hafen City, and you can see the granularity of those blocks on these kind of main, articulated, if you like, by this large Philharmonics hall, and a range of very, very beautiful principles that we discussed around porosity, accessibility, and this kind of very simple principle about spaces of encounter. So the master plan itself, as I said, is a very simple document, and the simplicity of the document belies the complexity of the outcome. This is something I'm going to discuss. Of course, the master plan was supported, again, by some very important basic principles, around six to 8 story blocks, the openness of the blocks, the openness of the ground floor, the double height of the ground floor, the fact that 75% of the building must touch the site edge, the fact that no two architects can work on neighboring blocks, and so on and so on. And these very simple rules of thumb became a kind of little mini mantra that then got elaborated and developed as the master plan itself started to be thickened up over time. Each of the precincts had a specific kind of planning logic, again, that tried to refine what that very simple kind of large master plan had set out. So the one that we know most so far from the slides is the one at the very top, and you might recognize this kind of teetering cantilevered block, which allows public access along the water's edge and allows private access, visual access, by leaning over and looking into the kind of watery, the watery zones. So it's clear that the section of this is very important, and also the porosity of the blocks themselves back through to the city itself, and through to that very beautiful copper-roofed warehouse precinct, and beyond that to the very famous spires of Hamburg city. Again, this is just a kind of example of the next stage between these very, very simple sketches. This is the work of EMBT. This is the work that they presented that was the winning kind of proposal for this kind of open space area. And you can see the huge amount of detail that they have to add in a way to kind of thicken this up. And this happens through a competition process, and also happens then through a discussion and dialogue after the competition itself. And these sorts of forums are very, very important in the translation of those very simple diagrams to those highly refined architectural proposals. So there's lots and lots of toing and froing, and in that toing and froing are some very sophisticated workshopping techniques, some very sophisticated communication strategies that allows precisely that trust to build up between a very simple drawing and a very sophisticated outcome. I'm sure many of you recognize the sort of atmosphere of each of these, the all-night crit, the politician review, the X of the public review, and so on. These are all supported by many other kind of formats like this. So this is as it is today. Most of the area we've been looking at is in purple, which is already complete. And as the project moves to the east, it's also the master plans themselves are being refined in greater detail. I'd like to show you this in more detail, but I feel like I'm starting to kind of run out of time. But the thing I want to show you is this central section, which is called the Übersee Quarter, and it's intended to be the commercial kind of sort of heartland, if you like, of the project. And the main thing to look out for is, first of all, you can see that the northern sector is already complete. There's a very important open site, which is a highly contested site at the top. And a number of other projects which are currently under development at the bottom in the south. So the main things I want to kind of point out here is the variations from the master plan itself. The master plan had this as a very simple gridded precinct, but you can see it's become a much more kind of romantic sort of cranking pedestrian way through the center of this. And that emerged again through many, many detailed studies that happened in between the period of the winning of the competition and the implementation of it and the adoption of it as the master plan for that quarter. And again, models become very important, public consultations, public engagement, description of these, and then greater architectural detail is then developed. And then finally we have some of the sort of reality of it as it is today. The fact that it's served by this underground, it's one of the first underground stations, is a very important aspect of this as well, which perhaps we can discuss later. This is a kind of mini conclusion in a way to this section, and I thought I'd like to show you this because it touches on the role of architects in working inside this master plan. So this is from last year. Richard Meyer, it says here, beats Foster to the Hamburg job. Zaha Hadid was also in the running for a mixed-use scheme. So that's probably no surprise to all of us because we know that mixed use is a very important part of this. Architectural competitions are also a very important part of this. But if you read the last paragraph, it says, Meyer's plans include a 7-story building. Again, no surprise, that fits exactly within the master plan. With a taller vertical building volume on the northeast corner. This is almost a direct diagram from the one that I showed earlier. The partner in charge said, by treating the exterior appearance with a restrained elegance and by articulating the interior courtyard, again, another urban principle, and atrium through a series of more expressive elements, the building turns itself inside out in correspondence with the client's request of an inviting and identifiable headquarters building. There's no mention of the master plan. I think that's my point. This is highly determined by the master plan. It's highly determined by a very innocent set of principles. But because those little drawings sort of became little icons and were so widely held in the kind of planning community, architectural community, it became a kind of iconographic language, if you like, that somehow disappeared in the shaping of the project. And the fact that the term master plan doesn't appear here, I think, is one of the successes of it. In other words, it becomes a client-architect relationship, which is a relationship we all understand is prime in these sorts of projects. So, I think this is the final slide of the Halloran City project. It reminds us of a couple of things I haven't talked about so far. Public engagement is absolutely essential. So there's a huge model of the Halloran City precinct right in the center. There are many seminars, many events which are held around inside this space. And finally, very importantly, the slide on your right shows Professor Dieter Leppler. And Professor Dieter Leppler is an urban planning professor at Halloran City University, which is one of the kind of sort of core tenets, if you like, of Halloran City. And his role is really to promote the learning and the study of Halloran City as it develops over time. And again, this is a really important principle that basically this is a long, complex project. It's unlikely to be implemented as it was imagined at the very beginning. We have to learn as we go. And the role of the university becomes very, very important in providing those kind of learning skills and the feedback into the kind of planning processes. So Dieter Leppler is a very important kind of emblematic figure, if you like, that stands for this temporality of learning. Okay, I think I'm almost out of time, so I have I might just show one video, and this was to be the last section I was going to show, and this is the section where we move from the historical principles that we've seen to contemporary design tools that might support the ongoing implementation and development of open city principles. I think if we just start the video and maybe stop it after once it becomes daylight. So this is a model of Singapore, but it represents 5 million. It's a synthetic population of Singapore. So it represents 5 million residents of Singapore, and as you can see, it represents their home, work, school, shopping, and leisure locations. In the top left, you'll see a clock. So in a way, this is a kind of imagined day in the life of this kind of synthetic population of Singapore. This is the work of my colleagues, Professor Kai Axhausen and Dr. Alex Erhardt, and they lead a team of transport planners who are interested in this kind of modeling approach. Now, if you might just stop it there. The couple of things to kind of note. First of all, as I said, there are 5 million quote-unquote agents. This is the kind of synthetic population. You can see the kind of the mobility patterns, which of course is transport planners, that's what they're interested in. And you can see private and public kind of transportation. If we can keep the video going, we can begin to see traffic jams and all of those kind of important principles which transport planners are interested in ameliorating. But along the way, because this has become a very stable and quite reliable, statistically speaking, quite reliable population, it allows us to think of other kinds of scenarios. And those other scenarios might involve, for example, land use planning. We could test heightening the density in one part of the island, reducing it in the other, mixing functions in one place, pulling them apart in another, for example. And because this synthetic population behaves roughly in a very kind of macro way, as the existing population of Singapore does, it has more and more credibility as a planning tool. And this allows us to be very, very precise about some of the kind of things that we were experimenting with in the Open City Biennale in Rotterdam all those years ago. So I think I'll leave it at that, and perhaps we can discuss further down the track. Thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Rod Simpson, who I've known since I was at architecture school, I think over 20 years ago. A practicing architect and urban designer, Rod is also the director of the urbanism program at Sydney University. Rod.
I'd like to briefly reflect on why we're here. But before I actually get into the notes I've written here, one thing that we haven't heard about with Halloran City is actually the governance that's in place. And I think it's a very important thing. In fact, that's what I want to talk about, governance, which sounds boring, but we'll see. The thing is that there's very interesting institutional arrangements that have been set up in Halloran City, which actually embed the trust of the community. It allows the master plan not to be a master plan which is definitive, but allows it to emerge over time, and that's some of the images that Stephen showed. And I think that what I'm going to talk about is this need for thinking about new forms of not simply engagement, because it's not simply engagement that happens at Halloran City, it's actually who makes the decision is the real question. So, with that as a preface, why are we here? I think we're here because we're all interested in how we make the city and who decides what sort of city we want. I think we're in a situation where we feel we have lost our democratic right to determine the shape and quality of the city. But, in fact, we never really had a direct say. We've always entrusted government. But we've gone from a time when we looked to government to provide infrastructure to now when infrastructure and urban renewal needs to be bundled up and turned into a business opportunity. Because to be fair, we don't want to pay higher taxes. I mean, we're not here to blame the government. We should also be having a bit of self-reflection here, I think. And just before we get carried away and paint too rosy a picture of the past, it is hard to be nostalgic about freeways that carve through the city, improving access to the city centre, but destroying and cutting off vast areas in the process. I think it's fair to say that we accepted freeways and other urban vandalism because we had a shared view of the city as a machine for wealth creation for all citizens. I think that this view has faded, if not collapsed. We now see the city more as a machine for the accumulation of wealth by the few, and we see what we thought were public functions being handed to the private sector, and these privatised public functions are some of the most efficient parts of that wealth concentrating machine. What I'm talking about is building on the strengths of the city. We are always augmenting the city. We're making the roads bigger. We're making things more efficient. But what is that actually doing? It's not changing the city fundamentally. It's actually reinforcing the patterns of the city that we have just recognised as being problematic. In this process of privatisation, we feel we've even lost a modicum of accountability and transparency that we expect in a democracy. And this disquiet and discomfort is felt not just in those places that really are suffering the effects, but also, dare I say, in better off places like Balmain, Rozelle and Glebe, as we shall hear from Jane. So something smells not quite right. What's the problem and what can we do about it? Now, I don't think we should be here to bash government. I think we should be here to try and fix it. In my opinion, the problem is that the institutional arrangements for how citizens' voices are heard have not kept pace with our more sophisticated and complex view of the city. It's not a simple thing, democracy, anymore. And also our ever higher expectations. And on the other hand, there's the corporatisation and commercialisation of government functions on the other, which I've just alluded to. Now, if this sounds like gobbledygook, let's bring it down to ground a little bit. One of the main reasons we invited Stephen here was to hear about the different governance arrangements in Halloran City. It's actually run by a corporation. The corporation is at arm's length from government, but it's not just concerned about profits. It's not just concerned about revenue. It is fully engaged with all of the citizens of Hamburg and also the residents of the place. In other words, it's an emerging form of governance which is open and transparent, and I think, as you've seen, the results speak for themselves. So to see governance as a dry topic with little relationship to quality or character of places, I think is wrong. How do you design governance, and how you design the governance will fundamentally affect how you design the deal. And how you design and structure the deal is like designing the DNA of a project. And having genetically engineered the project embryo, you stand back and you watch it grow into Barangaroo. That's in the DNA of the deal, what we see there. So designing the governance and designing the deal is actually fundamental. So in my opinion, this is actually where we need real innovation. In the development of new forms of localised, place-specific entities that include local and wider community representation at arm's length from government. How often do we hear the refrain that the private sector knows how to do it better, faster, cheaper? The problem is, what is it? We don't necessarily want or need it, because it is actually business as usual. Business as usual will always aim for the highest profits with the lowest risk. Or in the case of infrastructure, perform a very narrow function and do nothing else. So instead, perhaps the first thing we should be asking when we approach individual places is, what does the city need? To illustrate my point, in the case of the Bays Precinct, do we need more expensive housing near the water and more cars? It's not a rhetorical question, I'm expecting some feedback here. Resounding no. Or do we need more affordable housing? Perhaps without any car parking, given the proximity to the city? Perhaps. Secondly, when we think of major infrastructure, we should be getting as much out of it as we can. For example, surely if we are going to build WestConnex, then we should be putting a metro subway in at the same time. So in conclusion, designing the governance, working out how citizens can be actively engaged and empowered in decision-making, not just consultation, the potential of entities that sit somewhere between government and the private sector, that are transparent, that report in the case of the corporation that operates in Halloran City. Not nearly enough thought has been given to this. And there's no amount, let's be clear, there's no amount of design excellence or starchitecture that can overcome a badly structured deal.
Thanks, Rod, for your provocative ideas, and I think that's going to lead to a really great discussion tonight. Now to Jane Marceau, a professor of the built environment at UNSW. However, tonight she joins us in the capacity of the community representative. Welcome, Jane.
And now for something completely different, I think. Back from the international to the local, but only partly so. Can you put up the next, who is doing that? Somebody over there. Thank you. The focus tonight of my talk tonight is the Bays Precinct. I live there. I've been involved with it for almost 10 years. This is not, as it were, a virgin urban renewal site. This is an urban renewal site where people have been extremely active for nearly 10 years in trying to get sensible planning for the area. We are deeply wedded to our sensible planning. In mid-2006, John Ment, who's down here, facilitated a community meeting at which we first planned the area, including transport. We worked out how to get access to the water. We used all our local expertise. And for a long time, we have tried to work with government in one way or another. I was the community representative on the task force. But we've maybe making a little progress, but I'm not sure. Today, I just want to deviate a little from what I was going to say. This morning, I was greatly honoured to be present at Gough Whitlam's funeral upstairs, as Clover has said. Noel Pearson was an amazing orator, but for our point of view, he reminded us of two planks of Gough's program, which I think are totally relevant today to us. The first was about unlocking and developing the talents of all Australians, and that includes all local residents. The second was to work for the enrichment and consolidation of our democracy. And I think that our cities are where the flaws in our democracy are becoming increasingly apparent, and where citizens need to take action about their democracy, whether it's new forms of government or other kinds of values that they put forward, or the way in which they conduct themselves in relation to the city. We need to be vigilant. I think both of these, all of these, are relevant to the Bays Precinct as it were, in a city in miniature, a city in merging. This is an area that belongs to everyone. We who live there have needs for our children, for open spaces, for recreation and for work. And it is about coexistence. If the open city is about coexistence, the Bays Precinct is definitely about coexistence. But we are only the custodians of the area, and that is what so many people forget when they see urban renewal areas come to mind. Third, of course, Gough made our cities in some really clear ways, and I don't think he's been quite honoured enough for that, and we need to remember him. To listen to Tony Whitlam talking this morning about how he remembered as a child in Western Sydney the fact that there were no sewers, no schools, no hospitals, reminds us how fragile what we have achieved is and how carefully we need to defend it. And that's definitely what we need to do in the Bays Precinct. This is the Bays Precinct, or part of the Bays Precinct, only half a century ago. When I sat on the task force, the Port Authority confidently predicted that in 2060 we would need so many tons of sugar, so many tons of cooking oil, and it would all have to come in here. Now, if you look at this, it tells you what kind of length of foresight we need to be able to maintain in areas like this. This is the Bays Precinct now, and it's a little bit of a difficult photo, but you can see where the Bays Precinct runs. I'm not sure how many people here know where the Bays Precinct is or what the limits of it are. It runs down the western edge of Pyrmont through Glebe and a section of Annandale and Lilyfield, through the densely populated White Bay to East Balmain, passing the White Bay Power Station on the way. As Clover said, it includes port activities, the cruise passenger terminal, the fish markets, many other related businesses, and thousands and thousands of residents. I just want to give you a little tiny sense of what we have been doing and what we need to do now. We began our campaigning in 2005-06 with a catch cry of putting an end to ad hoc planning. We were fairly optimistic then, and focused on the fragmentation of decision-making between the government silos, none of whom took any notice of all the other. There is one critical thing about the Bays Precinct in planning terms. It is all the foreshores are publicly owned. This is just astounding around Sydney Harbour and tells you how valuable a site this is. We fought off in the early days an absolutely monstrous cement terminal. I think it was going to be 53 metres high and 35 metres wide. It would have dominated the entire area. We fought it off because, or we tried to fight it off, and we succeeded by a series of chances, actually, because we were quite clear that this was far too valuable an area for cement. We were the lone voices at the time that said this was area far too valuable for cement. Now, of course, it seems to have shifted. We used to oppose DAs all round. All this, a little bit here, Elias over here, something else in Blackwattle Bay, a boat storage facility, which has actually turned out to be a complete monster. But we have had to change, and over this period, we have actually built a set of planning principles, and we are absolutely wedded to these principles. These principles are not negotiable. These principles are indeed the basis for negotiation. We do not argue anymore about the principles. We only argue about how they will be used in practice. They are the basis of any development that we should in any way find acceptable, not just for us, but for all of Sydney and beyond in this area. Tonight, you have, I hope, received a green sheet as you came in with the principles on, or at least some of the principles on. After Christina Keneally had set up the community reference group, in which 30 of us participated, we actually ended up, I think, with 67 principles. But we've gradually refined them because we realized that these are the most likely to be breached, and we do not intend to have them breached. I would just make one important point before I skip through the principles. This is that it occurred to me as I was thinking about this, that community groups and everyone who'd helped devise the excellent People's Planning Charter put together by the Better Planning Network all actually want the same things. These are not unusual principles. These are things that everybody wants. They are drawn from people's democratic experience, and they are things which people are now wedded to. We all seem to have come independently to the same conclusions, but it immediately, the fact that we have done so immediately raises the question of why we did so. What was it that made us say we have to step here and say this is as far as we wish to go? Why are our wishes, ideals, and so on normally, and inverted commas, ignored in practice? So the question then arises what to do about it, and for our part, we will run a people's campaign jointly with the City of Sydney and Leichhardt Council. You can see more about that as it develops on our website. 4 of us who've been organising so far have been invited to the summit, the International Summit, on the 19th and 20th of November, so we shall know more about what we need to do then. But I begin with the proposition that we need excellence in design for all development proposals, and that excellence is not a particular design. It is achieved by following the principles. Using those principles, we can assess both proposals and negotiate particularities, whether it's master plan, particular buildings, particular sets of activities, or others. Excellence is a concept which has many aspects, and for us, in a sense, it is overall social value that we mean by excellence. We don't necessarily mean anything particularly aesthetic. Indeed, I'm not quite sure whether there's anything wrong at all with the Benthamite principle of the greatest good of the greatest number. It certainly beats what we tend to have in planning terms now. So there are 4 principles which are, as it were, content principles, which Clover actually really mentioned for me earlier on, and 2 which are largely process. We say that precedence must be given to the public good as the overarching principle governing renewal of the Bays Precinct. As part of this, there must be no alienation of the foreshore from public ownership by sale or long-term lease. Sorry, if you could keep putting the principles up as thank you. There must be continuous public access to the foreshore as a core criterion for acceptance of all proposed development. And a significant proportion of Bays Precinct lands must be retained for public use. The process ones are indeed even more complicated, I think. The community of Sydney, local and elsewhere, must be able to fully engage in all stages of the planning process, including, in my view, both discussion of and decision about proposed major developments. We have suffered through, in the task force and elsewhere, the dreadful consultations where you're asked to give one-word responses to really complicated questions. And surprise, surprise, even through that, the community's wishes came through over the last, in that case, it would have been 6 or 7 years. So we have to find a way of the community being not involved, but collaborating in this. That is what we need. We don't just need involvement. Ensuring ensuring the precedence of the public good also means that all unsolicited development proposals, and indeed all DDAs, must be open to competitive tender and proper public scrutiny. Transparency is a critically important principle. These are the only ones I want to present tonight. You can find the others in the Schiffer document, which I left some copies of, and you can see them as they might then apply to looking at critical issues: affordable housing, public transport, creative adaptation and reuse of heritage buildings. We recognise that we need to recognise the need for governments and private sector stakeholders to obtain a reasonable return on investment. But this is public land. The public good must be paramount. It is our land in the most collective sense. So in this sense, the key principles are public good, community as an equal decision partner, transparency in decision-making, and good governance. None of that will be easy. But those who are now our interlocutors, and instead of having silos, we now have a large urban growth in front of us. It's a different ballgame. But we need we need to build those institutions extremely carefully and to be involved as far as we can on all counts in these decisions. This is about getting equitable and sustainable cities that Gough would have talked about, that Noel Pearson talked about in a more general sense, but Sydney residents have sadly gone for too long without. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, for reminding us of how our cities reflect the values of the day. And now to Lucy Cole-Edelson, who is an experienced facilitator and stakeholder engagement practitioner. She's the principal of Straight Talk, a stakeholder engagement consultancy. Lucy.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here to talk to you. And I'm quite awed by the wonderful speakers that come before me who've presented really very different views. Okay, that didn't work. Which direction am I meant to be doing it at? Oh, there it goes. Good. It's just slow. Beautiful. Having heard my fellow speakers, I thought I might just touch on each of these points, but possibly not in the direction that I've listed them. My speech tonight is really about engagement, and as Jane said, consultation isn't good enough. It needs to be engagement, it needs to be participation. And I just want to preface this by saying, as I've been saying now for nearly 30 years, it's not rocket science. It's really quite straightforward, and I think that some of the frustration that you've heard from the previous speakers arises because we just don't approach this in a very simple and straightforward way. I think that there's a lot of confusion, and I think that government is very scared of having the real conversations. And because we live in a society where the 30-second soundbite seems to dominate, and a conversation on Twitter can send everybody into a spin, we're actually shrinking away from engagement more than ever before. So if we start at the bottom, if you're going to have meaningful engagement, it needs to be impactful. It needs to actually make a difference. People give up their time and they give up their passion and they give up their energy because they want to make a difference. And you just heard, and it was very apparent from Jane's talk, the frustration and the anger that we create in communities when we don't treat them with respect and we don't involve them in a way which has meaning, when they give up their time and their effort and their energy and they see nothing coming from it. People come and work with us because they actually want to contribute to good decision making. They want to have a say, but they're also very sensible. They're like us because we are us. And we're all quite capable of understanding complex issues and weighing them up and understanding that sometimes there are things that are negotiable and some things that are not negotiable. What makes people cranky and what frustrates people is when we're not straight about what the decision is. Hence the frustration with the unsolicited proposals approach, which is very popular at the minute. So in terms of having impactful engagement, my plea to government in particular at all levels is please let's just have the real conversations. Please let's just have the conversations which say, if we're going to make this city work, then we need public transport that can move people around. And that public transport will come at a cost. It'll come at a huge dollar cost because the infrastructure is expensive, but it will also come at a cost because it means that our city is going to have to change in order to accommodate the extra people that we need to make it work. So let's have that real conversation with communities about which and what it is in their community that they value so that we can protect that. And so that let's make real decisions about how we fit in the additional density that we know that we need in order to make those public transport infrastructure decisions affordable. Engagement needs to be meaningful, and it means all those things that other people have said, which means that we do need to actually work with our communities in a way that is respectful and in a way that builds trust. And funnily enough, trust is at an all-time low, particularly in terms of not just governments, but in, I work with communities every day. I've just come from a very mistrustful meeting in Ashfield over a proposed development for a Woolworths site because communities don't have trust they don't trust the traffic specialist anymore. They don't trust the engineer, they don't trust the decision maker. So we need to actually acknowledge that there is that lack of trust, and we need to give people reason to trust us. So we need to work with them in a way that has meaning and in a way that respects them. We need to speak to them from the heart, and we need to speak to them in honesty. We do need to develop partnerships, and that means necessarily that some power needs to be shifted, and that is really the essence of all this resistance. Communities have been saying that they wanted to be involved in their futures since the 1960s. And, we need to actually shift the way that we make decisions. I don't believe that communities need to make all decisions, and I do believe we have a democracy and we have systems in place that we do abrogate decisions for. But that doesn't mean that every decision has to be made by a remote government at any level. There are things that we can do with communities which actually help communities to be stronger and help cities to be better. So the meaningfulness for me is for us asking who is in the room and who isn't in the room, and what is it that we actually need from this process and from this community, and what is the best way to ask it, and what is important. Next, engagement needs to be engaging. It needs to actually be energising. It needs to be educative. I love that example that Jane used. I just did a survey today where, 3 different pictures came up. Look at these 3 pictures and pick one that you would most like to see. It doesn't actually give us a lot of meaning. So it needs to be engaging, it needs to be interesting. Funnily enough, people are interested. It is interesting what we do. Building cities is interesting. Understanding how traffic works is actually very interesting. Understanding how buildings are designed and the thought that goes behind architecture and public domain planning is infinitely interesting. Yet we constantly bring it down to the lowest common denominator and treat people, dare I say it, like mushrooms. I think that engagement needs to be fun. And people should want to enjoy it. I've put deliberative there because it's the latest buzzword, and one of the things that I was asked to do was to talk about the newest approaches. To have a deliberative approach, it means to get a group of people into a room where you actually present them with a range of information and provide a process in which they can weigh those things up to make decisions and to indicate their preferences. It's about choice work. So it requires thinking, it requires critical thinking, it requires contemplation, it requires dialogue and sharing. There's a very popular approach at the minute which is based on random selection, so getting a randomly selected, demographically matched group of people to consider mean and weighty issues. The City of Sydney recently ran a citizens' jury on a vibrant and safe city, and New Democracy Foundation has been championing that. But we are finding that deliberative approaches can be used at any level, and funnily enough, everyday citizens, when given access to good information, will come up with sensible decisions and ideas. And I think one of the biggest fears of government, that communities aren't sensible, is one of the most frustrating, because we are eminently sensible. We actually get how the world works, and having some courage around that would be really helpful. A deliberative approach also, though, suggests that we examine the role of stakeholders and that we ask ourselves about the constituency of stakeholders and the level of voice and the level of notice that we give to different constituent groups. I'm constantly called in to work on projects where the extremes of an argument, the extremes of an issue are dominating all the time and effort. I'm working on a project at the minute where the only voices being heard are the absolutely extreme voices, and yet the issue at hand is an issue which affects each and every one of us. So how do we actually talk to that middle ground of people? We need to be listening to those stakeholders. They both have valid views, but they are not the only views. What we need to be doing is being confident that we are hearing all the views and working with those views in a constructive way to actually create a city that is livable for all of us. So I guess I really just want to leave you with you saying that for me it is about participation beyond engagement. Not all of us want to participate in everything, and that's okay. What we need to do in order to do our job well is to make sure that we've given people the opportunity to participate if they want, and that we can be confident that we've given them the information that they need so that they can actually make informed choices and informed engagement and engage in a fun way. So I think that what we're talking about is very important. I'm excited by it still, even though I am frustrated at times. And I am really hopeful, knowing that as I do, that we have members of both the Department of Planning and Urban Growth in the room, and I'm so glad to hear it, that we can start these conversations in a way that means that we can actually build a great city. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And now we are running a bit over time. Can I ask you to just stay for 10 more minutes and to hear from our panel? So if I can invite up our speakers, our keynote speaker, Stephen Cairns, Rod Simpson, James Marceau and Lucy Cole-Edelstone. Now, to the panellists, I'm going to ask some really quick questions, and I want you to respond with just 1 or 2 sentences. So here we go. Okay. Now, Rod, we often hear from architects and designers that creating a place more slowly and collaboratively allows for finer grain. What do you mean by this?
Well, look, it goes again to this idea of how you set up the deal. I mean, if we hand over major slabs of the city to single developers and designers, it really means that there's not that opportunity for the place to emerge, for individuals to express themselves, even in fine things like even the colour they paint their house. So the fine grain is actually important because it encapsulates this idea of the city being able to develop incrementally, both in those initial development phases, but actually it's served us well for thousands of years. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Stephen, can you expand on how you built trust and what is it about the governance structure that worked really well? And this role of prototyping and piloting and testing where you demonstrated good design.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Rod said, there is this intermediate arm's length company, and this is really central. And the governance and the leadership of that company, furthermore, is very, very important. So Hafen City, Hamburg, wholly owned by the municipal government of Hamburg, basically runs the project, and they have built up a huge amount of trust through the track record that they've built up themselves. So I think in the initial phase, that was through the CVs and the track records of the members of the board and the CEO himself, who is a former academic and has a very good kind of research track record in his own right. But very soon, the good decisions built up, and then that in itself, the competition, the transparency of the competitions, which has a very big kind of, it's a big part of design culture in Europe anyway. But those decisions kind of snowballed, and it built a kind of momentum. And then very soon the first buildings were built, and there was evidence that good decisions had led to good results. And I think that is a really important kind of dimension to it.
And Stephen, KPIs, how did that governance entity actually measure its kind of performance and its success beyond just the sort of financial revenue?
I must say, I don't know the KPIs specifically, but they certainly have in big bold letters, world's best quality in sustainability of urban practice. And this, there is no pressure really on that land. If it's polluted and subject to flooding, that's a major interruption on development pressure. So that's a massive advantage. As soon as you put a subway, as soon as you put major investment, then the clock starts ticking. But you leave it polluted and you leave it flood prone, there's no pressure at all. And it seems to me the Bayes Precinct is also fallow in many respects.
As is so often the case with some of these new projects.
As soon as something flips, then I think the race is on, then that's dangerous. But I think there are really important things to be learned around this kind of fallow, how to manage the fallowness of a site, manage its decrepit state, because that's a very important kind of resistance to everybody kind of diving in and a kind of boom scenario.
Thank you. Now, Lucy, your role is also all about building trust. What can we learn from projects like Hafen City and build trust with the community in shaping the city? And I guess I'm really interested in your idea about when you talked about the extremes, but what about hearing from young people? What about hearing from working parents? Because I think there's so many voices that are so often missed when we're creating new places. How do you do that?
Well, you need to work at it.
Yeah.
You need to work hard. You need to find those people. Increasingly, you need to provide them incentives to actually come and play. If you want to talk to young people, you need to pay them. You need to bribe them straight out. If you have any fantasy that they're going to front up and want to talk to you, forget it. They've got much better things to do. And so it's quite possible to do it. I think that what Hafen City shows us is that by constantly demonstrating how you've actually heard and responded to things, that's what builds the trust. People just really want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's the great opportunity that we have with something like the Bayes Precinct, is to actually harness the passion and the ideas and be able to say, okay, so this is what the community wants for this area. So this is how we're interpreting that, and this is what we're doing. And to constantly come back and use that as a touchstone to say, you told us this is what we're doing. It's the only way to do it.
Now, Jane, so often the community actually really wants that sense of certainty. They want to know what this place is going to look like in the future. The importance of seeing kind of what are the buildings going to look like, how tall are they going to be. Do you think the community would be satisfied with simply principles rather than that detailed master plan if they could see them being applied and modified and improved as the project goes on?
I don't think they're alternatives.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm quite clear they're not alternatives. We have actually always asked for a strategic plan rather than a master plan, so that we would get serious discussions about what kinds of things it would be a good thing to do there. Not, is this building nice or is that building nice? And the only way you build up trust is by transparency and recognition that you share a number of critical values. And I don't think there's any other way. I think that is the only way. You can be as nice as you like, or you can pay young people, or whatever. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is transparency, due process, clear discussion, alternatives on which people can have a serious discussion.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to just ask one final question to the panel, just in one sentence. How do you define design excellence, and how do you get the balance right in creating identity and sense of place? Stephen.
I just want to say, don't knock star architects to Rod. I think this is really, we mustn't alienate ourselves from good design, no matter how freakishly or branded it is. And I make a case, look very carefully at the Elb Philharmonic project. It's over budget, massively over time. But this, because the brief changed 5 or 6 times, it's a much larger brief now than it was, and it's a radically different project. But look at it online, follow it. It's a very, very beautiful project, and the way it sits in Halloran City, it seems to me, is a kind of very talented architectural practice working in a strategic plan, precisely.
So no star architects, Rod. Design
I love
excellence.
star architects. But my point is really simply that the design excellence comes into providing those star architects opportunities for exquisite buildings. And, you know, it's not about doing whole precincts and so forth. So star architects are also capable of doing exquisite responses to a framework that's been established that everyone's agreed to. So I think there's a lot of congruence in what we're saying here. It's getting that framework, having it engage with the people over time, and lots of good buildings.
Lucy, design excellence.
Yes, well, I'm not really, I'm not an architect. Look, for me, it's it's people-centred. It's buildings that actually work in the space where they are, and that people can interact with them in a way that resonates with them. For me, that's what it's really about.
And finally, Jane, great place, design excellence.
Well, I think actually that's not the question at the moment. I have to say that I don't think we're anywhere near getting buildings. We have so much work to do before we get near any buildings. So design excellence, I'm sure it'll be wonderful, and I work in a design department and all of that. But it's not the point at the moment. The point at the moment is to engage and collaborate local expertise. We are not idiots. We actually have a huge amount of information, but constantly we are opposed to people who say, or placed opposite people who say the community on one side and experts on the other.
So thanks,
That's
Jane.
That's not how it is.
I think you've reminded us of that, bringing us back to what we are talking about is the open city. So can I ask you to thank our panel tonight and our speakers tonight, Lucy Cole-Edelstead, Jane Marceau, Rod Simpson, and importantly, our keynote speaker, Stephen Cairns. And thank you to our audience. I hope you've been sharing your ideas on social media tonight too, and I hope that you too have enjoyed Sydney's inaugural Festival of Urbanism. Thanks to the Urbanism program at the University of Sydney and to the City of Sydney for hosting this event tonight. And please go to the Festival of Urbanism website for more information and a podcast of tonight's event. So thank you and good night.
Do